Hello, everyone, and welcome to our special council meeting for Wednesday, August the 16th. Welcome to members of staff, members of public, to council, and those that are watching on live stream. Earlier this evening, we opened the meeting of council to discuss a non-planning matter, and now we are at the public consultation portion of the agenda. I would like to advise that this meeting is being live streamed, audio and video recorded, and shall form part of the record, which will be retained according to the town's retention bylaw. And for more information about that bylaw, you may contact clerk's office. There are two items being brought forward this evening for information and public consultation purposes only, with no decisions being made tonight. I will now ask Deputy Mayor Fowler to provide our land acknowledgement statement.
Thank you, Your Worship. The town of Innisfil acknowledges that Innisfil is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history. The town also acknowledges that this land is the traditional territories of the First Peoples of Turtle Island. It is shared between the Anishinaabe people of Beausoleil First Nation, Chippewas of Rama First Nation, Ramos First Nation, and Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and we thank them for generations of stewardship. This meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people, and as settlers, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The town acknowledges the forced sacrifices that are the foundation of Canadian society today. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary or conflict of interest this evening? Seeing none, we'll move forward. Our first item concerns the proposed development charges background study and bylaw. We'll start with a presentation from Hemson Consulting, and then Council may have a few questions or comments, and then we'll have an opportunity for public consultation. At that time, we will hear from members of the public. All speakers will have 5 minutes to ask your questions or express your comments. Then staff or the consultant will respond where possible. Should anyone need to speak for a second time to identify an issue that has not already been raised or to receive clarification, they may be provided an additional 5 minutes. We don't have that many in the audience tonight, so I don't think that that's going to be a concern. After all members of the public have provided comment, Council will receive the information. Should any member of the public watching the live stream wish to make a comment, they can email Clerk's Services, and these comments will be provided to Council and town staff and taken into consideration before Council makes a final decision. You may also be added to the circulation list as an interested party, where you'll be kept informed and updated on any future information regarding the item. The email will be listed on the PowerPoint during our meeting and is also available on tonight's agenda that can be found on the town's website. We'll now hear from the town clerk, Patty Toma, on how our public notice of this meeting was provided.
Thank you, Your Worship. Notice for this public meeting was circulated in the newspaper on July 20th, 2023, and on the town's website.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Has any correspondence been received by Clerk's Services concerning this item?
Thank you, and yes, Your Worship. 2 pieces of correspondence were received by the Clerk's office. Item 1 was from Building Industry and Land Development Association, dated August 15, 2023, providing comments and questions to staff regarding water, wastewater, Orbit DC eligible costs, and library costs. The other item received was from the Innisfil Developers Allocation Group, dated August 15, 2023, providing comments regarding development charges related to water and wastewater allocation. As well, Your Worship, members of the public may provide comment or register their interest regarding this item during this meeting or up until Council makes a decision by contacting the Clerk's office.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, and I can confirm that members of Council have received both of those pieces of correspondence. We'll now hear from Jackie Hall from Hemson Consulting Incorporated, who will provide further context to the proposed background study and bylaw.
Yes, good evening, Your Worship and members of Council. It's a pleasure to be before you again. As mentioned, my name is Jackie Hall. I am a consultant with Hemson, and I am one of the consultants in charge of the town's development charges background study. Here at the meeting this evening, virtually as well, as Craig Binning, who's the partner in charge of the Municipal Finance Branch at Hemson, and he will also be available to answer any questions that either Council or members of the public may have at the conclusion of the presentation. So with that being said, if we could go to the next slide. Just to reiterate, the purpose of today's meeting is to provide the public with opportunity to make representation on the development charges bylaw. As the clerk mentioned, this was why we had our notice of public meeting, which was circulated in accordance with the requirements of the legislation. The background study was made publicly available on July 28th, and in accordance with the legislation as well, the draft development charge bylaws were made publicly available on August 2nd, which was 2 weeks in advance of this meeting. We've also had ongoing consultation with the development industry. The legislation only requires us to have one public meeting. However, in keeping with the town's past practices, the engagement with the industry is a quite important part of this analysis and this study. And so we've had 2 meetings to date, one on April 3rd and one on June 15th. And we'll continue to have dialogue with the industry and members of the public leading up to the bylaw passage, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. Next slide. In accordance with the legislation, services are generally consistent with what the town currently levies for development charges, with a few changes that have been introduced leading up to the passage of this future bylaw as a result of some changes to the Development Charges Act. So for example, general government, or what we typically refer to as growth-related studies, is now an ineligible service. And so you'll see that throughout the presentation when we compare the town's current rate to the proposed rate. That charge is now identified as 0. It is no longer eligible to be included in the calculation. We are also introducing a new service as part of this round, which is related to bylaw services. So there is a minor component of the charge now attributed to that service as well. The other eligible services that we are continuing to bring forward for the town on a townwide basis include library, protection services of fire and police, parks and recreation, public works and roads and related services, which are both related to what we would call services related to a highway, and municipal fleet. We also have 2 area-specific rates, which are charges which relate to water services and wastewater services, and they're based on various benefiting areas in the town, which I'll get into later on in the presentation. If we go to the next slide. There are several legislative changes which came into force in late November of 2022. Many of those in the room, I'm sure, are familiar with Bill 23. And as a result, the bylaws that we are proposing to bring forward have been and the study itself have been brought forward in conformity with those new requirements of the legislation. Some of the key changes I wanted to just highlight for council and the member of the public as part of this presentation this evening is that the fully calculated rates, in which you'll see in this presentation, must be phased in over a 5-year period, and I'll provide some further details on that. There are exemptions for affordable and attainable housing that are now also required. However, they're not yet enforced. We are expecting some additional information related to how those types of housing units are defined to come forward likely sometime late 2023, potentially 2024. There's also discounts for rental housing, which is based on the number of bedrooms and units. Interesting, the background study and the bylaw itself, the bylaws used to have a statutory life of 5 years. That has now been extended to 10. We're also continuing with some of the town's non-statutory discounts and exemptions, which include exemptions for hospitals, places of worship, agricultural uses, and farm buildings. And one other important policy change as part of this update is that we have now differentiated the town's non-residential rate. Previously, it was levied on a uniform basis. So irregardless of your non-residential type of non-residential development, you would pay the same rate. What we've done now, and through previous correspondence with council, we've been directed to now differentiate the rates between industrial and non-industrial sectors. So I'll discuss that as well in a little bit. Next slide. The development forecast is an important part of our development charge calculation. For the purposes of this update, we are looking at 2051 planning horizon, which is related to transportation services or roads and related services. We're using a 10-year development planning horizon for other services of library, parks, protection, the services I talked about a few slides ago, and a medium-term planning horizon, if you will, for water and wastewater infrastructure, which extends to 2041, which aligns with the 2018 Master Servicing Plan, which is the current and most up-to-date master servicing plan that we have. We recognize that the 2023 Master Servicing Plan is underway. However, the information was not available, or it will not be available to be incorporated into this analysis at this time. So we're still relying on the 2018 study. The development forecast has been informed by the 2021 census data, the recent municipal comprehensive review completed by Simcoe County, as well as the draft secondary plan analysis and the associated phasing plan included in that document. Next slide. I appreciate there are a lot of numbers on this slide, but really what this is intended to do is provide a snapshot of the 300-page study that we have before council and the public. Essentially, what this is showing is a summary of the capital programs that we're bringing forward by service grouping and the costs that we've identified for funding through the development charges rates. So as I mentioned, we have a 10-year planning horizon of 2023 to 2032 for all the general townwide services, library, fire, police, parks and rec, et cetera. And so you can see that we've made the gross costs are identified in the far left-hand column, and in keeping with the requirements of the legislation, we've made adjustments for any sort of anticipated grant funding, any ineligible shares of projects, which we refer to as benefit to existing. If there are available DC reserve monies to fund projects, we account for that as well. And then on the far right-hand side of the slide, you see that we have a post-2032 or post-2051, if we're looking at roads and related services. That's simply a way of us recognizing that shares of these projects will either benefit growth occurring beyond the planning horizon, or that they've exceeded what the legislation will allow us to recover as part of this study. So at the bottom, it totals the townwide capital program, which is based on the 10-year planning horizon, and the roads and related townwide services, which is based on the longer term planning horizon to 2051. So in total, it's about $1.16 billion. After our adjustments that I mentioned, the DC eligible share of the capital program is reduced to $734 million approximately, which is just over 60% of that total gross capital program cost. So we're not intending to fund the entirety of the program through development charges, but it does make up a significant component of the capital projects and the funding that we've identified. Next slide. As we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have continued to have ongoing dialogue with the industry and their consultants as part of our work. Since the release of the background study on July 28th, we have reviewed the submissions that we've received, and where appropriate, we've made adjustments to the calculations based on the comments. As a result, the rates that were identified in the background study dated July 28th, we have made adjustments which have reduced the rates by approximately 1% on the townwide portion. And really, that's just related to a few comments around the treatment of the negative reserve fund balances and the relationship to what the legislation allows us to collect for as part of the DC rate structure. And we felt that those comments were warranted an adjustment. As was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have received new letters or submissions and questions from the industry as of yesterday. So we are still working through that material. I would note that if any other changes or alterations are required as a result of those discussions with the industry, or as a result of responding to the letters, any sort of changes will be outlined and brought forward before council in advance of the passage of the bylaw. So any changes will be outlined if warranted. Next slide. So the rates that you see before you on the slide here do reflect that 1% decrease on the townwide rates that I mentioned previously. And so what you can see here is that the bulk of the townwide rates are made up of the roads and related services of about 47%. That's not surprising, as roads and related and engineering infrastructure tends to be some of the most expensive DC services that we find. Parks and Recreation also has a healthy share of the pie at about 34%. And then the other services of library, municipal fleet, Parks and Recreation, and protection services makes up the residual. Our townwide rates also vary based on residential unit type, and that reflects the occupancies or number of people that tend to reside in those types of units. So single and semi-detached, as they have a higher occupancy, they're going to pay a higher rate, and that's calculated currently at $53,681. For a small apartment, which would have a lower occupancy, and that's defined as a bachelor or one bedroom, those units would pay $23,968. And just for clarification, this does exclude the water and wastewater rates, which I will talk about momentarily. Next slide. The chart on the slide in front of you provides a comparison of what you would pay today at the counter if you were to pull a building permit for a single detached unit versus what you would pay once the fully calculated rates are implemented. So we're looking at a total change of about 11% on the townwide rates. That includes changes to the roads and related capital program. By and large, many of the services are increasing, with the exception of general government. As I mentioned, that is now ineligible, so it's shown as zero going forward. And library board, there's been a bit of a decrease of the rate there as well. Next slide. On the non-residential side, this is the differentiated rate. So this is the rate calculated for industrial developments on a per square meter basis. So not dissimilar to the residential pie chart that we showed 2 slides ago. The bulk of the rate is made up of the roads and related charge, with about 77%. One thing you might notice, which is different on this slide than the residential rate, is that we do not charge for services such as library and Parks and Recreation, recognizing that those services are primarily driven by residential development. They're not allocated and recovered for by the non-residential sector. So you don't see a rate or a line item associated with library and Parks and Recreation for either the industrial or non-industrial rate. And so our total calculated charge for the industrial rate is $116.78 per square meter. Next slide. So what you'll see when we compare the current versus calculated industrial rate is a bit of a different relationship than what we saw in the residential comparison. We're actually looking at a decrease of about 10% overall for this rate. This is a function largely of differentiating the previous uniform non-residential rate. So that's the $130.16 per square meter that you would currently pay today in the town of Innisfil if you were to take out a building permit. However, going forward, after the bylaws are introduced, we are looking at a differentiated rate. So that would result in the industrial sector actually paying less than what the current rate is. And so that's a decrease of about 10%. I'll show this in a couple of slides, but the non-industrial sector will actually have a higher rate as a result. This approach is revenue neutral to the town, but it is a way of calculating the non-residential rates that is employed by many municipalities in the GTA and surrounding areas as well. Next slide. So the non-industrial rate, once again, no surprises here. Roads and related makes up the bulk of the charge. The other services comprise of the remaining 26%. So for the non-industrial rate, that would include our commercial developments. They would pay $222.24 per square meter. Next slide. And so you can see here that when we compare the non-industrial rate to the current uniform rate of $130.16 a square meter. That's an increase of about $92 a square meter, or about 71%. Next slide. As I mentioned, the legislative changes now require us to phase in our calculated rates. So we cannot charge that fully calculated rate that I showed you on those previous slides. So it's a bit tricky to do a comparison of the current versus calculated, because you're actually only able to levy or implement 80% of the fully calculated rate in year one, and it's phased in up to 100%. And 5% increments up to year 5. And so you can see on the slide in front of you, for example, a single and semi-detached unit in year 1, they wouldn't actually pay the $53,681 I mentioned earlier. They would pay instead the $42,945 for that unit. So I'll provide a couple more comparisons in the next slide, but just keep that in mind as we're going through the presentation. Next slide. So I did mention that there are area-specific rates for water and wastewater infrastructure. The map on the slide here provides the boundaries of those areas. It's 5 distinct servicing areas of Innisfil North, Friday Harbor, Innisfil South, Innisfil Central, and Cookstown. So if we go to the next slide. Once again, this is just intended to provide that high-level overview of the capital infrastructure that we've identified for the different servicing areas and by the different infrastructure types. So included in the water wastewater capital programs includes major infrastructure for wastewater treatment and also water supply. Those 2 items make up the bulk of the programs. Sanitary sewers, pumping stations, forest mains. We also have a wastewater treatment facility for Cookstown, and the recovery of negative reserve fund balances. Once again, I will stress this is based on the 2018 Master Servicing Plan. We recognize that some changes will be coming forward as part of the 2023 Master Servicing Plan update, and there will be opportunity as part of subsequent amendments to the DC bylaws in order to account for those changes to the infrastructure. However, as this is the best information we have at this time, we're continuing to work with the outputs and information that was included in the 2018 Master Servicing Plan. And so the total gross capital program is about $878 million. We've made some adjustments for shares of projects that are proposed to be funded from other municipalities. We have some benefit to existing shares as well. And then the total eligible share of the program brought forward is $849 million. So let's go to the next slide. This is intended to show, just if we were to isolate the water and wastewater rates, so not including the townwide rates, just to show the differences in the current versus calculated. So for areas such as Innisfil North, Friday Harbor, Innisfil Central, and Cookstown, we are seeing an increase in the water and wastewater rates. This is a function of the capital program and recognizing that costs have been indexed, and also as well adjustments for any sort of known development that has occurred since the last background study. In Innisfil South, we have seen a decrease in the rate in that area, and that's a function of some of the projects being removed, completed, and no longer needed. Once again, we would expect that these areas could be updated and looked at further once the 2023 Master Servicing Plan is completed. Keeping with our current practice in the town's existing bylaws, the water and wastewater rates are levied on an area-specific basis for residential and a townwide basis for non-residential. So industrial developments, we see that similar relationship to the townwide rates. It's actually a decrease from what you would pay currently at the counter of about 30%, and the non-industrial would increase by about 35%. Next slide. Just bringing both the town-wide and area-specific rates together into one graphic to help illustrate how the rates are changing. What you have on the left-hand side of the slide in front of you is a bar chart comparing the current, which is shown in green, to the calculated rates. So that layers in both the town-wide and the area-specific. So for example, if you were constructing a single detached unit in Innisfil North, Today at the counter, you would pay $71,922. In 5 years from now, once the fully calculated rates are introduced, you would pay $82,505. That rate would also be subject to indexing over that time. Similarly, on the non-residential side, we have a comparison of the current, which is shown in green, the calculated industrial, and the calculated non-industrial rate, which is shown in gray. Next slide. Once again, the implication of the phase-in is that we will not be able to charge the fully calculated rate until year 5 after the bylaw has been enacted. So in year 1, we're looking at 80% of the calculated rate. So in Innisfil North, I'm sticking with that example I gave on the previous slide. Rather than paying the fully calculated rate of the $82,505, you would pay $66,004 for a single and semi-detached unit. Next slide. To help illustrate this a little bit further, we thought it would be helpful to show how that year-over-year change would compare to the current rate. So once again, sticking with Innisfil North, just for sample purposes, the current rate of $71,922 is what you would pay right now if you were to go to the counter and pull a permit in that area for a single detached unit. After the bylaw is introduced, we can only charge 80% of the rate. So we're actually looking at less. You would pay 8% less once the bylaw is introduced in year 1 than you would today. And similarly, we see the same thing happening in Innisfil South. There'd actually be a 20% deduction in year 1. Cookstown would be a 6% deduction. And then gradually, just showing the year-over-year change, you would pay incrementally more based on what you were paying in the previous year as a result of the phase-in. Next slide. Similarly, on the non-residential side, the industrial rate, you're going to pay about 37% less in year 1. But on the non-industrial side, recognizing that that is quite a bit of an increase, you're looking at a 20% increase in year 1. Next slide. Now, we get asked all the time when we do our development charge studies to provide comparisons of neighboring municipalities, what their rates are, where they stand, and begrudgingly we do it. It's a little bit challenging sometimes to provide a good apples to apples comparison of municipalities, recognizing that many municipalities have different growth pressures, they have different groupings of services, servicing responsibilities, they might have different standards and service levels that impact the rate. Nonetheless, we do think it is somewhat helpful to provide this context. And so what you can see on the slide in front of you is simply a comparison of the town of Innisfil, the current versus calculated rates. And to make things a bit more confusing, we've also layered in the phase-in. So year 5, which is the fully calculated rate, is shown in the blue arrows, and year 1 is shown in the yellow arrows. And so what you can see here is that Innisfil is towards the top of the pack with respect to the Simcoe area municipalities. Our firm also recently completed the City of Barrie's background study as well, so we've added in their year 1 and year 5 rates. And of course, as other municipalities are bringing forward new bylaws, we would expect them to also be subject to these phase-ins as well. So that's just the disclaimer I'll put for now. If we go to the next slide. We've added in some of the other GTA municipalities as well, just to provide that comparison. So looking at a single and semi-detached unit in Innisfil Central in year 5, you're looking at a rate of about $116,127 per single detached unit. And that includes both the county's rate, the town's rate, as well as the education development charge, which is the EDC shown in red. And so you can see that the town, with the year 5 rates being shown, which are the fully calculated rates, sitting in the middle of the pack when we're layering in the GTA municipalities, which include Markham, Vaughan, Brampton, Newmarket, and Richmond Hill. Next slide. On the industrial side, we were able to kind of fit everything in one side. So we are showing both a mix of the Simcoe area municipalities and the GTA municipalities. As you can see here in year one, for the industrial rate, layering the water wastewater infrastructure, it's a total of $253.84. In year 5, we move up, kind of stay in that middle of the pack once again, and it goes up to $303.57 per square meter. Next slide. On the retail, or what I've been referring to as the non-industrial rate, throughout the presentation, we have that similar relationship once again. So in year 1, we're looking at a rate of about $434.77. And then once the fully calculated rate is introduced, it will increase to $529.74. Once again, I'll just note as well, as these municipalities continue to update their bylaws, they'll be subject to the phase-in. And so these are just a current snapshot of the rates based on what's in force at this time. Next slide. Just to conclude the presentation this evening before we open it up to the public and council for questions, we just wanted to provide a bit more context as to where we've been and where we're going with the study process. So the work was initiated earlier this year, and then throughout the spring and summer, we've been working very hard with staff in order to calculate the rates, bring forward material to yourselves and also the industry to provide comment on. Today, we're now hosting the statutory public meeting with the passage of the bylaw targeted for September 27th and the rates coming into force on January 1st of 2024. So with that being said, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hall. Much appreciated. Are there any questions from council? Councillor Waters.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I always find it educational to learn new things every time we come here. So, but there are a few questions I have that come out of that. And first question is, and I understand it's a difficult one when we're comparing municipalities, but both on residential, non-industrial, and industrial, we seem to be significantly higher than Bradford, which is directly south of us. And when we're all in the business of trying to attract business and we're interested in attracting new residents, can you explain to me why the difference between two close communities of relatively same size?
Ms. Hall?
Yes, through you, Your Worship. It's a very good question, and I kind of alluded to some of the reasons for those differences at the beginning of the discussion on the rate comparators. One of the reasons could be the differences in the service groupings and the standards of service that are provided between Bradford and Innisfil, for example. We also, we also don't account for, or the comparison doesn't account for any sort of recognition of, discounts and exemptions that might have been provided prior to the Bill 23 changes coming into force. There could be, as I mentioned, different groupings of services. And so that can really cause those differences. But by and large, the relationship between the neighboring municipalities, I know it can sometimes look dramatic, but relative to, it's a reflection of the cost of infrastructure and land prices that are occurring within each of those areas as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Eisses.
Thank you, Your Worship. I find this discussion very, very interesting. I think of it a little bit as, this is our budget for 5 years, and we have no leeway to change it after this is put in place. So just thinking out loud, do we know how we did 5 years ago when we set our development charges and forecasted what we would receive and what costs, and how we ended up over those 5 years? That would be my first question.
And I'm not sure if that's fair for Ms. Hall, or if I should be passing that off to Mr. Milanish and Ms. Webb.
Through your worship to Councillor Ices, it's, I don't have all those answers off the top of my head, but in terms of, the revenue forecast, I don't recall exactly. I think our growth numbers were fairly aggressive in the last background study. And in terms of the capital program, we do sometimes have, we follow our capital program. I think for the most part, it's fairly close. With the exception, the last background study and inflation that we've experienced over the past number of years as a result of COVID, we certainly seen some escalations on capital projects. And so, the actual costs were higher than was contemplated in the original background study.
Yeah, and I guess that wasn't a totally fair question, but what I was trying to get to is, so what tools do we have when we get 3 years down the road and the financial situation is different? Whether costs have gone way up, we can't charge any more DCs because we have these rates for 5 years. As council, what are our options?
Ms. Webb?
Through your worship to Councillor Ices. So we do have the option of opening back up the background study and revisiting that. So if we did some analysis and we thought that, our capital cost had increased substantially and it warranted an update, we do have the option of doing that. It becomes trickier now because of the phase-in, the required phase-in. And so, it causes us to pause and think and analyze whether we would want to do that, because as soon as we open up the background study again and redo those rates, we have to start at 80% again. So it's something that we're watching, we'll pay attention to, and if it's warranted, we would make that recommendation. That said, I don't know if Hempson has anything else to offer to your question.
Ms. Hall?
Through you, your worship, I might turn it over to Craig Binning, who had his hand up.
Yes, thank you. Through the mayor, Ms. Webb really covered off the major points. I just also want to stress that we do index the rates for changes in the construction costs, and those have been running relatively high at around double digits. It's moderating now, so that does account for some of the adjustments. And I do think prices are going to start normalizing, hopefully somewhat soon. So hopefully we don't see those same shifts. We are going to try to structure the bylaw or bylaws to allow for easier approaches to amending or updating the rates if new cost information comes through, especially as it relates to water, wastewater services and the new master servicing plans that are coming forward. But as Ms. Webb indicated, we have to be somewhat cautious given the additional requirements for phasing in the charges and also the consequences around some of the other Bill 23 consequences. But we'll continue to work to try to mitigate any of those changes in costs over time. If they do go down, the index has historically occasionally gone negative. So that does result in a reduction if prices of construction go down as well.
Go ahead, Councillor Ices.
So a second question I had was with regards to the industrial, non-industrial changes. I was happy to see those. I guess maybe a little bit of context in how you arrive at those different rates. And, following up with Councillor Waters' comment that people start their businesses and DC charges are a big impact on where they choose to build. And so that would be my question on how we got to those numbers.
Ms. Hall or Mr. Binning? I can't see any hands, so I'm just putting it out there for anybody who wants to answer it.
Yes, through you, your worship, perhaps I'll start, and if Mr. Benning has anything to add, he can do so. It's an excellent question, and I did gloss over the calculation because it's a tad bit, well, not boring, but it's there is quite a bit of math that goes behind it. So essentially, what we do is currently the town has a uniform non-residential rate. What we've done is then allocate costs between the industrial and non-industrial sectors, and the resulting rate is essentially a function of the anticipated employment growth and the anticipated non-residential floor space that's associated with both of those non-residential sectors. And so it's revenue neutral to the town because we're still allocating the same amount of cost to the same amount of employment and the same amount of floor space growth. However, what it does is it results in a differentiated rate because essentially if everyone's paying the same rate, some sectors are paying a little bit more and some are paying a little bit less. In all municipalities that have a differentiated industrial and non-industrial rate, the industrial sectors tend to pay less and the non-industrial sectors pay more.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Councillor Saunders.
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't know who to address this one to, but these rates seem to be quite hefty over 5 years. Have we anticipated any decline in building in Innisfil over that time? Because it's going up like 20%. So in 5 years, are we anticipating any decline?
Who wants to take that one? Ms. Lee?
Thank you, Mayor Dolan. No, Councillor Saunders, the decline we saw was perhaps 1 year during COVID, just with those circumstances. But when you actually look at the last 5 years, the building permit activity has continued.
Thank you. Other questions? Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have two questions. One is a question specific to the letters that we got from Build and IDAG. And the other one has just a general education for myself and maybe other councillors. First of all, in the agreement that we signed with IDAG, it says that interest is not included in those costs. And so my question is, why are we basically funding that? Isn't that something that that if we're putting the dollars forward, that we should be able to charge the interest on that? Is that not part of the capital expense? So just a question on interest. Thank you.
Would that be Mr. Melanesian?
Through your worship, I'm looking at town solicitor on the IDAG agreement, just the details on the specifics of that.
Through your worship, I can certainly pull up the agreement and look for that reference. I wonder if that references to the not getting credits back for interest. But let me take a quick look and see if I can.
I think we can have that one take away because both those letters will have to be responded to, and we'll see those response. So we will get that answer, Councillor Waters.
Thank you. And like I may have read the letter incorrectly, but I stand to be corrected. The other question is just general education in terms of we have, when you build a community, there's all sorts of infrastructure that goes in. There's hydro, there's gas, there's water and wastewater. We're not here discussing hydro. We're here not discussing gas. We are discussing water and wastewater. And so my question is, historically, why is that a DC charge when we own InPower and we own InServices? So why is there no DC charges for InPower or gas, but there is for water and wastewater? And is there a different way for funding these things based on the other models that exist? Thank you.
Mr. Melanesian?
Through your worship, great question, Councillor Waters. I can't remember the year, 2014-17, when the Ontario Energy Board split off the power utilities. They became separate and standalone through utility model for rates. The DC Act is what governs what we can charge. So the DC Act says that we can charge for water, wastewater services, roads, libraries, those things. That's very prescribed development charges. Hydro is not not an eligible DC cost that we can apply to development. It's all governed by the DC Act, what is included and what's not. And hydro is not included because they are considered a separate private corporation under the Ontario Energy Act, and they now have their own model of rate funding.
Okay, so, but so is in-services. So in-service and power, are they not the same thing? Yeah, one is covered and one isn't?
Great question. Through your worship, there is a distinction with water and wastewater. Because it is, council has the authority to create a bylaw to charge developers for the development charges under the DC Act. There is no authority to charge under the DC Act for hydro. We collect, the authority comes from council to create the bylaw, to collect those fees. We collect them and then we remit them to in-services, to the utility to apply for water, wastewater infrastructure.
Thank you.
I can maybe help there, Councillor Waters. It's because in most municipalities, water and wastewater are part of the municipality and are not a separate corporation. So in almost every other municipality, it would be part of the budget, the municipal budget. If I'm not right, please correct me. And then also to the Bradford question, and again to Councillor Saunders, the whole idea around DC charges is that growth pays for growth. It doesn't totally cover growth, and now after Bill 23 it covers much less growth, but it's always been the philosophy that in growing communities that it shouldn't be the existing taxpayers paying for growth. So when new people move to town and you've got new residents, they need to pay for a little bit of a snowplow and a couple of library books and a park swing and all of the things that they're going to use in that community to make it a better community. And I'm not sure, Ms. Hall or Mr. Binning, if you do Bradford's DC charges, but I'm wondering where they are in their cycle, because there wasn't a phase year 1 to year 5 for them. So I'm guessing that they're not, that they'll be coming up to doing their DC review shortly. Can you answer that?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I think you're correct on that. I was just, I didn't get a chance to look at the bylaw, but I think they were, they'll certainly be within the time frame of your current bylaw. My other recollection, although I haven't looked at the rate breakdown, they're not one of our clients, is that I believe your roads capital program is much more extensive than that of Bradford West Gwillimbury, and that's one of the prime differentials there. And because of some of your more scattered communities and scattered development pattern, the linear infrastructure of the water wastewater is more complex and more extensive than it would be in Bradford. So even though the population-wise they're similar, the nature of your servicing is more challenging and more costly, which is reflected in those cost differentials that we're seeing. I would anticipate that Bradford's numbers would move higher as we move forward into the next round. And just further to that, they probably haven't captured all of the significant price increases that we've seen through COVID. We've been dealing with municipalities, I'd say 30 or more over the last 2 years, and seeing DC rate increases of 25, 50, and upwards of 100% because of those significant changes in infrastructure costs that have been experienced across the province and really across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Binning. Yeah, so 1 fire hall versus 5 fire halls is probably part of that answer.
That's what I was expecting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Other, Councillor Drudge.
Through your worship, so just as we're phasing from year 1 to year 5, if a developer was so inclined to prepay their DC charges for their projects, like Lower Mills, for example, can they pay all their DC charges up front as year 1, because it would save lots of money down the road since it's tiering up year per year?
Yes, through the mayor, the Act allows for the prepayment of development charges, but the municipality is not obligated to enter into an agreement for the prepayment of DCs. So obviously, under this structure, I think most municipalities will be adverse to entering into DC prepayment agreements because of the foregone development charge revenues associated with the statutory phase-in.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Councillor Trott.
So in a project, something as big as the Orbit, could that developer be so inclined to prepay his DC charges?
Mr. Binning?
Yes, through the mayor. Clearly, I can't speak on behalf of the town, but I would think that given the fiscal consequences of doing that, there'd be some reluctance to allow them to prepay at such a low, a rate that's 20% discounted, and that you would want to see them paying rates at or close to full cost recovery. And there'll be some additional elements related to front-ending agreement arrangements, I'm sure, through the Orbit, just as there was with other developments that occurred in the town historically.
Okay, thank you.
So I think the key message there was it's allowed, but it's up to us whether we want to allow it or not. Other questions or comments? I just had a couple. The huge swing that we requested in the industrial versus non-industrial, non-residential rate. And I'm just wondering out loud if there'd been maybe non-industrial that have been poking around and looking at areas in Innisfil and maybe have calculated what they think the rate might be, only to come back and find out it could be significantly higher. If there's anything captured in that, because it is quite a swing than what we've traditionally charged. Granted, I think the reason we looked at it in the first place is because the non-industrial usually has a much less footprint than, say, a retail. But I just wondered if staff had any comments on that, and whether or not there's the ability to phase it even further than what the province is requiring. So is there a way to make that resident non-industrial industrial rate, what's the word I'm looking for, softer, like spread it out more?
Through your worship, great question. As far as your first part of that question, as far as activity and industrial activity, I'll pass that to Director Lee. As far as people poking around, I will deflect to Craig as well. I think we do have other options as far as driving economic development. There's other tools, there's community improvement plans, CIPs, and other tools that we can use to entice people or businesses to settle, industrial or non-industrial. Unless Mr. Binning has something to add to that, I'm not too sure as far as the legislation goes to stretch the grandfathering to make it more attractive. Mr. Binning?
Yes, Madam Mayor. Clearly, Council still has discretion under the Act to implement rates lower than what we calculated or phase them in, which would be in addition to the mandatory or prescribed phase-in. So we'd want to be careful about how we structured the bylaw, because it does get layered on top. If you do a discount and say in year one the rate will be X, it will then be 20% less of that in year one, because you add the legislative prescribed discounting on top of whatever rates you set out in the bylaw. And there are other mechanisms like the CIP to account for that, and just recognizing as well as maybe we're differentiating it a little later in the game than certainly the GTA municipalities and even the South Simcoe ones. New Tecumseh used to discount its industrial charge by 40%. And then the study before last, we introduced the calculated differentiated rate, similar to what we've done here. And it does account for the differences in demand for services relative to the building space of the two different kinds of development. I recognize there's, a bit of a shock factor to that increase. So we'd be pleased to work with staff to come with some options on that.
Thank you for that. Realizing it's making it complicated over complicated over complicated, but it just seemed to be such a drastic thing. Ms. Lee, does anything come to mind? And you don't have to answer this now. It's not fair to make you comment on this at this time, but I'm cognizant of the phone call saying, we thought our DCs were going to be this, and now they're this.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Mayor Dolan. And I think, certainly from the economic development perspective, we're obviously going through the strategy right now. So we're in touch with a number of the businesses or also prospective businesses. So I think it's something we can certainly ensure that as conversations are happening with new potential businesses, we're advising them of the potential rates that are coming in. Obviously, no decisions by council yet. But I don't believe we've been doing that at this point with, there are a number of potential businesses looking at Innisfil Heights and other areas. So I'll reach out to the team tomorrow and make sure that they are having that outreach.
Thank you for that. So when we were doing all the comparisons with Bradford tonight, I noticed the big one was the non-industrial between what our potential rate is and theirs. And then one question about the phasing. So we're required to phase up. What about the ones that are going down? Do we get to phase them down, or do we have to give them the whole percentage down immediately? I think that's a Mr. Binning question.
I'm sure Jackie would have answered it just as well. The way the legislation is written is it's 80% of the rates that are in the bylaw. So if it's going down, it's 80% of that rate. So it goes down even further. So unfortunately, it's off of the newly calculated rates, and it's not the change in the rate. It's not only if the rates increase, it's the newly calculated rates that get discounted down through the phase-in.
Thank you for that. And my last is merely a comment, and it's about the fact that it showed in many cases that if a developer waited a year, they paid less DCs. And I'm not entirely sure how that's supposed to build more homes faster, but because I would think developers would maybe delay building to get the cheaper DCs, but that's just a comment on my part. Any other questions or comments from members of council? Seeing none, then we will now hear from members of the public who have questions regarding the development charges background study and bylaw. I understand that no one has registered to speak virtually, so I will call on those in attendance here at Town Hall to come forward to the podium and state their name for the record. Would anybody like to come forward and speak to the bylaw? I'm sure the only one I thought might want to do it would be Mr. Geist, and he ran out to get a phone call. So, oh, here he is. Mr. Geist, did you want to speak to this tonight? We're at the point where anybody from the public can speak to it if they wish. Thank you. Thank you. As a reminder, every person will have, oh no, we don't have any more. So we'll now go to the recommendation to receive. But first I'll ask Madam Clerk, did we receive anything in from the people that were live streaming?
Thank you, Worship. And no, nothing has been received by the clerk's office.
So thank you to everyone who has taken the time to watch this live stream. And I've skipped a piece here, excuse me. We'll now go to the recommendation to receive comments provided this evening. And can I please have a mover and a seconder for the recommendation on the screen? Councillor Richardson and Deputy Mayor Fowler, all those in favor? That is carried. Thank you everyone who's taken the time to watch this live stream meeting and presentation regarding the proposed development charges background study and bylaw. Anyone who wishes to provide comment may do so and may also register as an interested party to be contacted before this item is considered by council. Please contact the clerk's office at innisfil.ca. And council thanks everyone for their participation. We'll now move to the next item on the agenda, which is a proposed amendment to the town's comprehensive zoning bylaw, number 80-13, concerning 1803 9th line in the town of Innisfil. As a reminder, this item is being brought forward for information and public consultation purposes only, with no decisions being made tonight. We'll now hear from town staff, who will provide further context to the application, and then we will hear from council regarding any questions or comments they may have about the proposed amendment, and then from members of the public. As with first meeting, speakers will have 5 minutes to speak, and I'm not going to go through all that again. We'll now hear from the Town Clerk, Ms. Toma, on how public notice of this meeting was provided.
Thank you, Your Worship. In accordance with the Planning Act, notice for this public meeting was circulated 20 days prior to this public meeting to all landowners within 120 meters of the subject lands and to all required agencies on July 27, 2023. Corresponding signage was also posted on the property on July 27, 2023, and on the town's website and the Get Involved Innisfil.ca website for review and comment.
Thank you, Ms. Toma. Has any correspondence been received by the Clerk's Department concerning the proposed amendments?
Thank you, Your Worship, and no correspondence has been received by the Clerk's Office concerning this application. And just to reiterate that members of the public may provide comment or register their interest regarding this application during this meeting or up until Council makes a decision on the application by contacting the Clerk's Office.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Ms. Aurora Vision Maker, who will provide a high-level summary of the planning context of the proposed amendment. Welcome.
Thank you, Your Worship and members of the Council. The proposed housekeeping zoning bylaw amendment to Town Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw number 08013 pertains to file number D18-2023-002. The purpose of the housekeeping bylaw amendment is to update the changing policies, legislation, and regulations, and reduce conflicts when applying for regulations to development applications. It also pertains to correction of any text or mapping inconsistencies, with the overall goal of making Innisfil's development policies more efficient and up-to-date with the current legislation and policies, while upholding the spirit and intent of official plan and zoning bylaw. The subject of this housekeeping amendment is Municipal Address 1803 9th Line. The key map here shows the existing use, which includes a single detached dwelling unit and accessory structures, then a legal non-conforming use in the form of automotive industrial workshop, and the remaining lands being agricultural and environmental protection in use. The current zoning bylaw 08013 zones the entire property as EP zones, as shown in this map. However, the official plan designation demarks the property into two zones, as shown on the map on the left. The yellow area is representing agricultural area, while the green color is representing key natural heritage features and key hydrological features. These include significant woodlands, MNR, which is Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, unevaluated wetlands, and a stream which is going through north-south of the property along the western boundary of the property, as shown on the map, which is on the right side. So the right map is also showing the MNR unevaluated wetlands and the stream going through the property. The proposed zoning, so in this bylaw housekeeping amendment, we are rezoning the portion of the lands which are non-environmental in nature to agriculture zone, as shown on the map. So the yellow color is depicting the agriculture zone which we are rezoning from EP. However, the green color shows the environmental protection area, which is as demarcated in the official plan. The town staff has not received any public comments. The Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority supports the zoning change and has no objection. Next steps would be to review and consider any public, council, department, or agency comments and report back to council on a recommendation at a future meeting. And notice will also be provided to all those who requested notification or submitted any written correspondence. For any questions or comments, please contact me, Vision Maker Policy Planner, and my contact details are given here. You can also visit Get Involved page using this QR code. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kashmita. Are there any questions from members of council? Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have two questions. The first one has to do with, we must have hundreds of properties like this through the municipality. So why this housekeeping just on this single property? Was there something brought forward by a resident? Is there something being planned for this area? So I'm just kind of curious the history of what brought this forward as a house cleaning element.
Go ahead, Ms. Aurora.
Through your worship to Councillor Water, this was initiated by the landowner. So the town, because it's an error on the town side in the zoning bylaw, therefore the town is taking an initiative to amend this zoning error.
Thank you. My second question is, now that we're defining the EP area a little more strictly, was there any consideration, obviously not from the Conservation Authority, about creating a buffer zone around that? Because the worst thing you can have for an EP is to have development right up against it. And so I just wondered whether or not there has been any consideration of putting a buffer zone around that just to give some sensitivity to that area. So just out of curiosity, did we consider that?
Thank you. Did you want to respond to that, Ms. Aurora? I think it was a comment, or was it a question?
It was a question. Have we considered that?
Okay. Ms. Lee?
Thank you. Through to Councillor Waters. Essentially, we're trying to reflect, as would be consistent across the town, the boundaries of the environmental protection area specifically. There are obviously setbacks from a zone boundary, but it wouldn't be a significant buffer in terms of that environmental protection area. I think it's something we can certainly look at in the future in terms of should there be additional buffers, but that's not something that's in the current zoning bylaw.
I would think that'd be something we want to consider for the future, just because I know in regulations around floodplains and that kind of stuff, they often consider a buffer at the top of valley. And so I'm just kind of curious because these are areas, you know, if you allow development right up to the edge of that, the EP, within 10 meters, you've got 5 to 10 meters inside that, there's natural impacts from development, you know, in terms of tractors on or buildings on routes of systems that close. So it might be something we consider down the road, that, you know, it's still being zoned as ag or whatever else it might be, but just allow that, you know, development 3 meters may not be enough, but 5 meters might be a little better. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Ices.
Thank you, Worship. The application that is in front of us is in my ward, and I do know the property fairly well as we farm it. So I can speak to maybe some of Councillor Waters' concerns about the EP area. Just maybe a little bit of a history of how this came to this meeting. Ms. Lucic approached me when she found out, as in the presentation, when the current zoning where the EP goes right to the boundary of her property and enveloped her whole property. She has owned this property for over 20 years, and when she bought it, it was not zoned that way, and she really questioned how it changed so much from when she bought it and till what it is now. And she wanted to do some future planning on her property, and that designation would really inhibit some of her plans. So I was thankful that staff were able to realize the inconsistencies of the current zoning and brought it back to what I would say is proper. You have the agricultural zones there that are definitely agricultural. As far as changes to the zoning in the future, that, you know, those discussions can be had. And I do appreciate Councillor Waters' concern over buffers and that on significant areas. But this is an unevaluated wetland, which is very common in a lot of parts of Innisfil. But I am in total support of the housekeeping that we are talking about here tonight, and I thank staff for initiating this. Like a lot of times, official plans have to be initiated by the landowner, and recognizing the inconsistencies here, staff have done that to correct it. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Councillor Ices. Councillor Waters.
I totally agree with Councillor Ices. Like this is, I understand the rezoning, so I'm fully supportive of how they want to rezone it. My concern was just around the buffer area right there, so I'm fully supportive of the rezoning, but just that one little item was of concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from members of council? Seeing none, I apologize. I did skip one statement. It said that I understand that the property owner or their agent will not be providing remarks tonight, and I just wanted to make sure that was still true. We're good? Okay, thank you. We'll now hear from members of the public who have questions regarding the proposed amendment. No one is registered to speak virtually, so I will call on those in attendance here at Town Hall to come forward to the podium and state their name for the record. Is there anyone here who'd like to speak to this item? Seeing none, I will ask Ms. Toma, did you receive anything from people on the live stream this evening?
Thank you, Your Worship. No, we have not had anything received by the clerk's office during the meeting.
Thank you. We'll now go to the recommendation to receive the comments provided this evening. Can I have a mover and a seconder? And does council have any further comments or questions? Moved by Councillor Constantine, seconded by Councillor Ices. I have one question or comment, if I could, and that would be typically in the past when we've had these public planning meeting reports and there's been no issues from the public and no issues from any other stakeholder, quite often we would approve them the same evening. And we haven't done that here, but when would we be having this come forward again for consideration?
Thank you, Mayor Dolan. And in fact, that's a practice we were talking about today on some other applications that are coming forward. So you will see that in the future where we don't anticipate questions or comments, but we are looking to bring this application back in September.
Thank you for that. So all in favor of the recommendation? Any opposed? That is carried. So thank you. Anyone who wishes to provide comments may still do so and may also register as an interested party to be contacted before this item is considered by council. And please contact the clerk's office at clerksoffice@innisfil.ca. Thank you everyone for your participation this evening. And we'll now go to the recommendation that was moved by Councillor Constantine and seconded by Councillor Ices. All in favor? Oh, I already did that, didn't I? Yes, I did. Sorry. Thank you. So we'll now go to a motion to recess the special council meeting and reconvene into closed. Deputy Mayor Fowler and Councillor Zanella, all those in favor? That is carried. So that's the end of our public portion for this evening, but thank you everyone who is here. Much appreciate your participation and have a good evening. And we'll see everybody at our next council meeting on September the 13th.